Carbon County, Utah, September 1902. The late autumn sun was sharp in the thin mountain air, casting long, crisp shadows from the junipers that clung to the coal-dusted hills. On a small plot of land overlooking the gritty settlement of winter quarters, a man was doing something strange. His name was Konstantinos Mavridis, and his neighbors had already marked him as an outsider, a Greek who spoke in clipped, quiet sentences and moved with a patience that seemed alien to the frantic energy of a mining camp. He had built his cabin like the others, a solid 18-foot square of dark fieldstone gathered from the surrounding slopes. It was a respectable, if unremarkable, structure, but now he was ruining it. Day after day, he mixed a slurry in a wooden trough, a thick, paste-like mortar of a startling, unnatural white. With a steel trowel in one hand and a wooden float in the other, he was slathering this white mud all over his dark stone walls, covering the honest, rugged rock with a coat so thick it buried the seams and softened the corners. Miners on their way to or from the Pleasant Valley mine would stop and watch. They'd lean on their shovels, chewing tobacco, and murmur to one another. The cabin was beginning to look less like a house and more like a block of salt, or a misplaced iceberg that had calved off a glacier and stranded itself in the dusty Utah hills. Wilbur Holcomb, the mine paymaster, a man whose opinions carried the weight of the company payroll, made his pronouncement one afternoon to the men gathered near the pay shed. He gestured with his chin toward the gleaming white anomaly on the hillside. "That Greek's gone foolish," Holcomb declared, not bothering to lower his voice. "He's putting parlor plaster on an outdoor wall. Fine for a Phoenix hotel, maybe. But wait for the first real Chinook melt in March. That whitewash will run in streaks down the stone like a spilled crock of milk. He'll have the ugliest cabin in the county by April. Mark my words." The men chuckled. It made sense. You built with what the land gave you, dark stone, dark timber. You built to blend in, to endure. You didn't paint your house like a wedding cake. It was a profound waste of time and effort, the kind of madness that afflicted greenhorns before the land taught them its hard, gray lessons. What did this stone tower mason from the sun-scorched Mani Peninsula of Greece understand about radiative heat loss that the experienced miners and builders of the Wasatch Front had missed? This is a story about a different kind of knowledge, born of a different sky. If you stay with me, I promise you will understand the profound and elegant physics of how a simple white coating can triple a home's ability to hold its precious heat through a frozen, star-filled night. It's a principle that modern science has only recently codified, but that a man with limestone dust under his fingernails knew in his bones. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity, and let me know in the comments, what's the coldest temperature you've ever personally experienced? Konstantinos Mavridis was not a carpenter. He did not know the language of mortise and tenon, of scarf joints and king posts. He was not a miner, familiar with the treacherous slang of seam and shaft. He was a catistus. In his homeland, that meant a builder, but the word was deeper than that. It meant a man who understood stone, not just its weight, but its spirit. He came from the Mani, a finger of rock and sunlight pointing into the Mediterranean, a place where families built stone towers, not just for shelter, but for defense and for honor. His hands knew the heft of limestone blocks baked white by centuries of sun, the fine grit of marble dust used in waterproof cistern plasters, the precise curve of a vaulted ceiling that could bear the weight of a generation. He understood how stone breathed, how it held the day's heat, and how it gave that heat back to the cool night. He, his wife Eleni, and their two small children, Giannis and Sophia, had come to Utah the previous year, drawn by the promise of work that paid in dollars, not drachmas. The money was real, but so was the cold. Their first winter, spent in a hastily rented clapboard shack, had been a lesson in a kind of misery he had never imagined. The Aegean winter was a thing of damp winds and chilly rain. The Utah winter was a different beast entirely. It was a dry, predatory cold that seemed to suck the life from everything it touched. He remembered the morning he'd tried to shave. The steel of the straight razor, chilled by the overnight air in the cabin, had welded itself to the skin of his chin on contact, raising a bloodless white welt before it could even cut a whisker. He remembered Eleni trying to open the family Bible, its leather cover so brittle with cold it crackled audibly at the binding, threatening to split. Most vividly, he remembered the sight of his son Yanis's bootlaces. The boy had left his boots by the door, and the moisture from the day's snow had frozen them solid. In the morning, the laces stood straight up from the boots, stiff and stark as wires, a tiny, absurd monument to the absolute dominion of the cold. That winter, they had huddled around their small stove, feeding it a constant diet of precious coal and juniper. Yet the chill was never truly banished. It lurked in the corners, crept up through the floorboards, and painted the inside of their single window pane with a thick, opaque layer of frost. The problem, Konstantinos realized, was not just the cold air getting in. He could plug the gaps with rags and mud. The real problem was the heat getting out. At night, under the vast, clear, star-filled sky of the high desert, the warmth of his stove, the warmth of his family, was simply bleeding away into the infinite blackness of space. The shack was a sieve for heat. He vowed that when he built his own home, it would not be a sieve. It would be a vessel. It would hold the warmth as his ancestors' cisterns held the water. The conventional cabins of Carbon County were built to fight the winter with brute force. They were monuments to mass and fuel. Men like Silas Croft and Jedediah Potts, both experienced builders, followed the proven formula. They laid up thick walls of the dark, dense sandstone and fieldstone that littered the landscape. They chinked the gaps with a mud and straw daub, an efolbe, and they roofed their structures with heavy timbers and sod. Inside, they installed the largest cast-iron stoves they could afford, behemoths designed to consume enormous quantities of coal and wood. The logic was simple. A thick wall was a strong wall, and a big fire was a hot fire. And for much of the winter it worked, after a fashion. But it was a costly and inefficient war of attrition. The problem wasn't conduction through the walls, not primarily. The stone was thick enough to slow that process. The problem was radiation. The dark, rough-textured stone of their cabins had a high emissivity, a physical property that essentially measures how efficiently a surface radiates thermal energy. A perfect, black body, the theoretical ideal radiator, has an emissivity of 1.0. The dark, porous sandstone of the Utah hills wasn't far off, with an emissivity of around 0.95. This meant that as soon as the sun went down, the stone walls became perfect broadcasters, beaming the day's stored heat and the stove's hard-won warmth out into the cold, clear night sky. A cloudless night in the high desert acts like a cosmic heat sink, a vast, cold emptiness eager to absorb energy. The cabins were shouting their warmth into this void. Families like the O'Donnells, living down the slope from Konstantinos, burned through a cord of wood every 10 days during the deep winter. Their stove would glow a dull cherry red, scorching the air in a 6-foot radius around it, while the far wall of the cabin remained cold enough to form a ghost of frost outlining every nailhead. They stuffed every crack with newspaper and rags, but they were fighting the wrong battle. They were trying to plug a leak in a bucket that was designed to radiate water from its very surface. The heat was leaving not through the holes, but through the solid walls themselves. They woke up shivering, with a skin of ice in their water bucket and a deep, unshakable chill in their bones, resigned to another day of feeding the hungry stove. Konstantinos began construction in late July, as soon as he had saved enough to buy the small plot of land. He dug his foundation deep and laid the field stones with a familiar, practiced rhythm. He chose each stone for its fit, turning it over in his hands, seeing how it would lock with its neighbors. Eleni and the children helped him mix the clay and sand mortar, the same kind everyone used. The walls rose, solid and true, 18 inches thick. Wilbur Holcomb nodded with approval as he passed by one day. "Good, solid work, Mavridis," he'd said. "You'll be snug in that." Then came the strange part. Instead of finishing the chinking and moving in, Konstantinos began hauling sacks of fine white clay from a deposit he'd found in a wash 5 miles up the canyon. It was kaolin, almost pure. He built a slaking pit, lining it with timber, and filled it with quicklime chunks and water. For weeks, the pit hissed and steamed as the lime broke down into a fine, potent putty. When it was ready, he began mixing his render. It was a simple recipe, ancient and precise: 1 part lime putty, 3 parts clean sand, and a generous portion of the kaolin clay, which gave the mix its brilliant whiteness and smooth plastic texture. He started on the north wall, the one that would face the bitterest winter winds and receive no sun. He applied the render with his trowel, not as a thin skim coat, but as a thick, generous layer, building it up until it was a full 3 inches deep, burying the rugged face of the fieldstone completely. The other miners watched, bewildered. "That's 3 inches of mud that'll hold the damp right against your stone," Jedediah Potts warned him. "It'll never dry proper. Come the freeze, it'll pop right off the wall." Konstantinos just shook his head slightly. "It will be dry," he said, his English still thick with the cadence of his homeland. Once a section of the wall was covered, he began the most peculiar step of all. He took a collection of smooth, palm-sized river stones he had gathered from the Price River. Dipping them in water, he began to rub the surface of the damp render, pressing and polishing in slow circular motions. Hour after hour, day after day, he burnished the wall. The texture changed under his hands, the gritty surface compacting, transforming from a matte plaster into something with a sheen, a hard, dense skin that felt cool and slick, like polished marble. It was a technique he'd learned for sealing the inside of water cisterns in Manny, to make them impermeable. Here he was using it on the outside of his house. "He's polishing a mud pie," Silas Croft scoffed to his friends. "All that work for a bit of shine that the first dust storm will scour right off." Wilbur Holcomb delivered his spilled milk verdict, and the community consensus was set. The Greek was a hard worker, no doubt, but his ideas were from another world, and they were foolish. Eleni, too, had her doubts. "Costa," she said one evening, her hands in a bowl of dough, "it is so white, like a church on an island. Not like a home here." "Here," he replied, looking out at the darkening hills. "The sun is our friend in the day, but the sky is our enemy at night. In Mani, the sun is the enemy. The sky is the same. The answer is the same." He picked up one of his polishing stones. "This makes a shield, not for arrows, for the cold." He returned to his work, his movements methodical, untroubled by the mockery that followed him like a shadow. The physics behind Konstantinos's white wall were as elegant as they were misunderstood by his neighbors. The secret lay in 2 separate but related properties: albedo and emissivity. Most of the onlookers, like Wilbur Holcomb, focused on the color. They saw whitewash and thought only of appearance and durability. They were looking at the problem through the lens of visible light. The high albedo, or reflectivity to solar radiation, was indeed a benefit, though a secondary one in winter. The brilliant white surface, with a 92% albedo, reflected the vast majority of the sun's shortwave radiation. In the summer, this would keep the cabin dramatically cooler, a lesson learned in the blistering Aegean. In the winter, it meant the walls wouldn't absorb as much of the weak daytime sun's heat as a dark wall would. This seemed like a disadvantage, but it was a small price to pay for the wall's primary, and far more powerful, secret: its performance in the long-wave infrared spectrum. All objects with a temperature above absolute zero radiate energy. The warmth you feel from a hot stove or a sun-baked rock is infrared radiation. This is where emissivity comes in. While albedo governs how a surface reflects incoming energy, emissivity governs how efficiently it radiates its own energy away. A dark, rough surface like sandstone is a fantastic radiator. Its high emissivity of 0.95 means it broadcasts its stored heat with near-perfect efficiency. Konstantinos's wall, however, was a terrible radiator. The combination of the lime, the fine kaolin clay, and the burnished smooth surface gave it a very low long-wave emissivity, around 0.32. In the world of thermodynamics, this is a massive difference. It meant that for every 100 units of heat, the neighbor's dark stone walls were beaming out into the black hole of the night sky. Konstantinos's wall was emitting only 32. It wasn't blocking the heat with insulation. It was simply refusing to let it go. Think of it this way. A conventional cabin was like a person in a cold room wearing a dark, thick wool sweater. The sweater slows heat loss through conduction, but its surface still radiates warmth efficiently. Konstantinos's cabin was like a person wearing a thin, silver emergency blanket. The blanket has almost no insulating R value, but its reflective, low emissivity surface prevents radiative heat loss, keeping the person warm by reflecting their own body heat back at them. His 3-inch render wasn't insulation. It was a mirror for infrared light, turning the cabin's inner warmth back upon itself. It held on to heat more than 3 times as effectively as any other structure in the valley. That November, the weather turned. The mild, golden days of Indian summer vanished, replaced by a hard, metallic sky. The first snows came, dusting the high peaks, then blanketing the valley floor. By mid-December, the cold had settled in for good. But this was just the overture. In the first week of January, a massive high-pressure system stalled over the Great Basin, pushing the jet stream far to the north. The clouds vanished and the air grew still, thin and terrifyingly cold. It was the beginning of what old-timers called a Wasatch radiative crash. For 9 consecutive nights, the temperature plummeted to 31 degrees below zero. With no cloud cover to act as a blanket, the Earth radiated its heat directly into space. The cold was absolute. Metal became brittle. The sound of an axe splitting wood was a sharp, gunshot-like crack that carried for miles. At the O'Donnell cabin, they moved their beds into the single room with the stove, the whole family sleeping in a huddle of blankets and coats. Mary O'Donnell spent her days melting snow for water because their wellhead had frozen solid. Their woodpile, which they thought would last till March, was dwindling at a horrifying rate. At the Holcomb house, larger and better built than most, the paymaster found the ink had frozen in the inkwell on his desk, even though the desk was only 15 feet from a roaring fire. He was beginning to feel a flicker of unease about the coming weeks, a feeling unfamiliar to a man of his standing. But inside the strange white cabin on the hill, a different reality was unfolding. The cold laid siege to the walls, but it could not breach them. The thermal mass of the stone, heated modestly by their small cook stove during the day, now held that heat through the night, unable to radiate it away through the low emissivity white shell. The air inside was still and calm. There were no drafts, no ghosts of frost on the walls. The temperature difference between the floor and ceiling was less than 5 degrees. The ultimate proof of their comfort was a small, domestic ritual. Eleni, a meticulous baker, kept a sourdough starter in a ceramic crock on a small table against the far wall of the cabin, the greatest possible distance from the stove. Every night she fed it flour and water. In any other cabin in Carbon County, the starter would have frozen solid, killing the yeast. In Konstantinos' home, it continued to bubble gently through the night, alive and active, a quiet testament to a pervasive, room-filling warmth. While their neighbors fought a desperate battle for survival, the Mavridis family was simply living. The numerical contrast was stark, minus 31 degrees outside, a stable 65 degrees inside with only a small banked fire. The visual contrast was even starker. At the Schmidt cabin, a dipper of water left on the table would develop a skin of ice in under 10 minutes. At the Mavridis cabin, the pitcher of water Eleni filled for the night remained clear and perfectly liquid until morning. The cold had been defeated so completely it had become an abstraction, a number they heard about from others, not a reality they felt in their bones. Angus MacLeod was the rural postman, a wiry Scot who had been covering the Carbon County routes for a decade. He knew the rhythms of the camps better than anyone, knew who was sick, who was feuding, and who was expecting a letter from the old country. His days started long before dawn, sorting mail by the light of a kerosene lamp. On the 9th morning of the deep freeze, the coldest yet, he set out on his rounds. The air was so sharp it hurt to breathe, and the crunch of his boots on the snow was the only sound in the frozen world. As a matter of professional habit and personal survival, Angus judged the state of a household by its chimney smoke. On a morning like this, smoke was a sign of life. A thick, roiling plume meant a family was feeding the stove frantically, fighting back the cold. A thin, lazy wisp meant they were either running low on fuel or had a tightly built house. No smoke at all was a cause for alarm. As he approached the cluster of cabins at winter quarters, he scanned the chimneys against the pale, pre-dawn sky. Every single one was pumping out smoke. The O'Donnells was a torrent of gray, the Schmidts a frantic black plume. Even Holcomb's big house was puffing away like a steam engine. All except one. The white cabin of the Greek man, Mavridis, stood silent on the hillside. No smoke, no steam from the flue, nothing. Angus felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had a letter for them, the thin blue paper covered in the looping, unfamiliar script of their homeland. He pictured the family inside, still and silent, having lost their battle in the night. He urged his horse forward, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Just as he reached the base of the hill, the first rays of the sun broke over the Wasatch crest. The light, a pure cold pink, struck the snow-covered peaks and then raced down into the valley. When it hit the Mavridis cabin, an astonishing thing happened. The building did not just become visible, it began to glow. The smooth white walls caught the dawn light and reflected it, turning the entire structure a soft, luminous rose color. It looked serene, peaceful, like a pearl nestled in the gray, frozen landscape. It did not look like a tomb. Later that day, stamping his feet to stay warm in the company store, Angus saw Wilbur Holcomb. "Mr. Holcomb," he said, his voice still raspy from the cold, "damnedest thing I saw this morning." He recounted the tale of the chimneys. Every soul in this valley was fighting for their life last night, burning everything they had. But that Greek fella Mavridis, not a wisp of smoke from his chimney at dawn, not a one, and his house was lit up like a lamp by the sunrise. Holcomb frowned. It made no sense. No smoke meant no fire. No fire meant freezing. Yet Angus was no fool. The paymaster's certainty began to erode, replaced by a nagging, persistent curiosity. That afternoon, on the pretext of discussing a land survey, he walked up to the white cabin. Konstantinos invited him in. The first thing Holcomb noticed was the air, It was warm, but not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove. It was a gentle, even warmth. He saw the two children playing on the floor in their shirt sleeves. He saw Eleni kneading bread on the table, and he saw the pitcher of water. He remembered his own pitcher that morning. The water had been a solid plug of ice, which his wife had to thaw on the stove for an hour before they could even pour it for coffee. On the Mavridis table, the pitcher was full of clear, liquid water. There was no rim of ice, no frozen skin on the surface. It was impossible. He walked toward the wall, the source of his public ridicule. He had expected to feel that familiar bone-deep chill that radiated from any exterior wall in winter. He reached out his bare hand, anticipating the biting cold of the stone. Instead, his palm met a surface that was merely cool. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was neutral, inert. The wall wasn't sucking the warmth from his skin. It felt peaceful. The gap between what his experience told him he should feel and what his nerves were actually reporting was so vast it broke something in his mind. His confidence, his certainty, his casual mockery, it all collapsed into a quiet, stunned awe. He looked at Konstantinos, who was watching him with calm, knowing eyes. Holcomb struggled for words, his gaze drifting from the placid wall to the pitcher of liquid water. You didn't build a wall, Mavridis, he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. You built a mirror. The conversion of Wilbur Holcomb was as quiet as it was total, but the story's spread was carried on the daily rounds of Angus MacLeod. The postman became the technique's most fervent evangelist. At every coal camp door he served, from Schofield to Clear Creek, while delivering letters and catalogs, he also delivered the recipe. It's the Greeks' way, he'd explain. Lime putty, sand, and that pure white clay from up near Soldier's Summit. You put it on thick, 3 inches at least. Then you polish it smooth with a river stone till it shines. Mavridis says it holds the heat. The first to listen were the other Greeks. A shared language and a trust in old country wisdom made them receptive. That spring, as the snows melted, several other Greek masons began hauling kaolin and slaking lime. By the crisp autumn of 1903, 9 cabins in 3 different Carbon County camps wore the brilliant white coat. They stood out against the dark hillsides, a small constellation of improbable icebergs, a testament to a shared, secret knowledge. The fuel savings were dramatic, with families reporting they used less than half the coal of their neighbors. The white cabins became a badge of identity, a visible sign of a community that knew how to survive not by fighting the winter, but by understanding it. What Konstantinos Mavridis accomplished on that Utah hillside was a quiet miracle of applied physics. His simple, elegant technique anticipated the principles of modern building science by more than 70 years. Today we talk of cool roofs, coated in white membranes to reflect solar heat and reduce air conditioning loads. We manufacture windows with low emissivity coatings that use invisible metallic layers to do exactly what his burnished plaster did: prevent radiative heat loss. He had created a passive system for thermal mass optimization, using ancient materials to achieve a result that modern engineers now strive for with complex technologies. He was a man ahead of his time because he was a man deeply rooted in a very old time. There is a profound lesson in the white cabin. His neighbors saw the brutal Utah winter as an enemy to be fought, a force to be overpowered. They met the cold with brute force, burning mountains of fuel to generate overwhelming heat, most of which bled away into the night. Theirs was a strategy of resistance, a constant, exhausting battle. Konstantinos saw it differently. He understood that the killing cold of a clear night was not an attack, but a transaction, and relentless drawing out of warmth. He chose not to fight it. Instead, he simply, elegantly refused the transaction. He didn't paint his cabin against the weather. He taught the wall to send the weather back the way it came. His innovation wasn't a fortress wall to keep the cold out. It was a mirror to hold the warmth in. It was a victory not of force, but of reflection. If this story of quiet genius and practical wisdom resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It tells the great algorithms of the world that stories of human ingenuity are worth sharing. For our next conversation, let us know in the comments below, what other lost or forgotten building techniques do you know about that hold lessons for us today? We'd love to hear your stories. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.